The night of the Vale Pack's succession ceremony was cold and clear. Stars filled the sky above the forest, and the full moon hung low and bright, casting long silver shadows across the open ground where the pack had gathered. Everyone was dressed in their finest. Torches burned at the edges of the clearing. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders to see better. There was music and laughter, and the smell of roasted wood in the air. Ethan Vale stood at the back of the crowd, alone. He was 27 years old, broad-shouldered and quiet, with dark eyes that watched everything and gave away nothing. He was not small, and he was not weak-looking, but inside the Vale Pack, appearances meant very little. What mattered was power. What mattered was your wolf, and Ethan's wolf had never shown itself, not once in all his years. No shift, no silver eyes, no burst of speed or strength that the other wolves carried naturally. Nothing. Just a man who moved through pack life like a ghost no one wanted to acknowledge. His father, Victor Vale, stood at the front of the crowd in his ceremonial coat. He was a tall man with the kind of confidence that fills a room. He had led the Vale Pack for 20 years, and tonight he was naming his successor. The crowd leaned forward as he raised his hand and turned toward his stepson, Cade. Cade was everything Ethan was not. In the pack's eyes, anyway. He was charming, loud, always laughing. His wolf had shifted at 16, strong and dark. The pack loved him. He stepped forward now with a wide smile as Victor draped the heavy ceremonial cloak over his shoulders. The crowd cheered. Wolves lifted their heads and called out. Ethan watched until he could not watch anymore, and then he turned and walked away into the dark. No one noticed he left. That was perhaps the hardest part. Not the ceremony itself, not the cloak going to Cade, not even his father's proud face. The hardest part was that not a single person in that crowd turned around to look for him. He had spent his entire life in this pack. He had grown up among these people. He had worked their land, repaired their buildings, and kept their roads clear through winter. And not one of them turned around. Ethan walked home and sat in the dark kitchen of the small house he had been given at the edge of pack territory. Far enough from the main grounds that it could almost be forgotten. He made himself a cup of tea and sat at the wooden table and breathed slowly, the way he had taught himself to breathe when the weight of his life pressed too hard against his chest. There was something strange that night, something in the air, or maybe in him, a pressure, low and deep, like a sound too quiet to hear but still felt. He pressed his palm flat against his sternum and frowned. It was not pain exactly. It was more like something pushing gently from the inside. It had been happening more often lately, always at night, always under the moon. He had learned to ignore it. He had learned to ignore a great many things. His days had a rhythm that never changed. He was up before dawn. He worked. He ate alone. He worked again. He went to sleep in a house that had no photographs on the walls and no warmth that did not come from the fire he built himself. His mother had died when he was 9 years old. Her name was Elena, and she had been gentle and bright, the kind of woman who hummed while she cooked, and always knew when something was wrong before you said a word. After she died, Victor Vale had grieved for 2 years. Then he had married a woman named Serena, who had a son named Cade, and slowly, as naturally as a tide coming in, Ethan had been moved to the edges of his own family. He had tried to be enough. He had tried for years. He studied harder, worked harder, stayed quiet when he wanted to speak, and spoke carefully when he could not stay quiet. None of it mattered. Victor looked at him with something that was not quite contempt and not quite indifference, but lived in the uncomfortable space between the two. The pack followed their alpha's lead. If Victor did not value Ethan, they saw no reason to either. Cade, for his part, was not satisfied with simply being preferred. He needed Ethan to know it. He made small cuts often and public ones when the opportunity arose. He borrowed tools and never returned them. He spoke over Ethan in meetings, as though Ethan had not spoken at all. He gave Ethan tasks that were beneath anyone's dignity, and watched to see if Ethan would refuse. Ethan never did. He just did the tasks. This seemed to frustrate Cade more than any argument would have. Then came the night Ethan met Lyra. He had gone to the forest, as he often did when the walls of the pack felt too close. There was a place he knew, an old part of the woods where the trees grew wide and the undergrowth was soft, and nobody ever came. He had been going there since childhood. It was the only place he felt truly quiet. She was crouched near the roots of a large oak tree, working with careful hands on the leg of a small fox. The fox was still, either unconscious or trusting her completely. She had strips of cloth laid neatly beside her, and a small pot of something that smelled like pine and clean earth. She did not jump when she heard Ethan's footsteps. She simply looked up. Her eyes were a calm, steady brown, and they looked at him the way most people did not, without measuring him first. "You can come closer," she said. "He is not afraid of you. I can tell." Ethan stepped closer and looked at the fox. He crouched down. He stayed very still. The fox opened one eye, looked at him, and closed it again. "You have a gentle presence," she said, still working. "Not many people do." He did not know what to say to that. He could not remember the last time anyone had described him as having a presence at all. Her name was Lyra. She was a healer, trained in old wolf medicine and herb lore, and she lived without a pack, a choice she had made years ago. She spoke easily, without pretension, and she asked him nothing about his rank or his wolf, or his standing in any pack. She talked about the fox, and about the forest, and about the way the old healers used to say that every living thing carries a frequency, like a note in a song, and that some notes are so deep and old that most people cannot hear them at all. Ethan sat with her until the fox had been wrapped and was resting comfortably in a nest of dry leaves. The sky was beginning to lighten. He realized he had talked more in those few hours than he had in the past several weeks combined. When he stood to leave, she looked up at him and said simply, "I hope you come back." He did come back, every evening for the next 2 weeks. The end came the way ends usually come, not as one single moment, but as the last of many moments, stacked one upon another, until the structure could no longer hold. Victor called Ethan to the main hall on a Tuesday evening. When Ethan arrived, the inner circle of the pack was already gathered. Cade stood beside his stepfather with his arms crossed. Ethan understood immediately that this was not a private conversation. It had been designed as a performance. Victor spoke for a long time. He talked about the Vale Pack's reputation. He talked about strength and legacy, and what it meant to carry the family name. He talked about expectations. And then, slowly, he arrived at the point. He said that Ethan's continued presence was a source of confusion and discomfort for pack members. He said that a man without a wolf had no real place in a wolf pack. He said, and his voice was steady and calm when he said it, that he was formally removing the Vale name from Ethan. As of that evening, Ethan was no longer a member of the Vale Pack. He was, in the language of Wolf Society, a lone wolf, unaffiliated, without standing. No one in the room said a word. Ethan looked at each of them in turn, the faces he had known his whole life, the people who had sat at his table, who had eaten food he helped prepare, whose children he had helped carry in from the cold on winter nights. Not one of them met his eyes. He thanked his father for the clarity. He said it quietly and without anger, because there was no anger left. It had been replaced by something older and quieter. He walked out of the hall and did not look back. He walked into the forest. He did not have a destination. He just walked until his legs decided to stop, and they stopped in the place he had always gone. The wide old oak trees, the soft undergrowth, the part of the forest where nobody came. He sat down at the base of the largest tree and leaned his back against it and looked up through the branches at the sky. The moon was full. The pressure in his chest, the one he had been carrying for months, became suddenly unbearable. It was not like pain. It was more like pressure behind a locked door, a force that had been patient, that had been waiting, that had decided tonight it was done waiting. Ethan pressed his back harder against the tree. The bark was rough. The ground was cold. The moonlight came down through the branches in long white lines, and then something in him broke open. It was not violent. It was not loud. It was more like a dam releasing, a sudden rush of something vast and ancient moving through him all at once. The trees around him seemed to lean inward. The light concentrated. The forest went completely silent, in the way forests do when something rare is happening. His wolf came, but it was not like any shift the Vale Pack had ever seen or spoken about. It was enormous, larger than any wolf in living memory, and it moved with a kind of gravity, as though the earth itself recognized it. Its eyes, when they opened and caught the moonlight, were silver, not amber, not gold. Silver. Pure, deep, ancient silver. Ethan did not know what it meant. He only knew that for the first time in his life, he felt completely and utterly whole. He was not alone. An old man was standing at the edge of the clearing, leaning on a wooden staff, watching. His name was Soren. He was the oldest wolf in the region, a keeper of records and bloodline histories, and he had been alive long enough to have seen things that most wolves believed were only stories. His eyes were wet. He was smiling. "I have been waiting for this night for a very long time," he said. He sat down slowly in the grass across from Ethan, and he began to talk. He told Ethan about his mother, Elena. He said she was not simply Victor Vale's first mate. Elena had been born from one of the oldest bloodlines in wolf history, a line that stretched back further than any pack record, back to the time of the first Alpha King, the wolf from whom all pack structures ultimately descended. The bloodline had been deliberately hidden for generations, protected by those who understood how dangerous that kind of power would be if it were known too early. Elena had carried it quietly her entire life. When she died, she had asked Soren to remain silent until her son was ready, until the blood itself decided to surface. The blood could not awaken in comfort. It needed pressure. It needed fire. It needed loss. Every dismissal, every public shame, every cold night in that small house at the edge of pack territory, all of it had been building something inside Ethan, not destroying him, forging him. Ethan sat very still through all of this. Then he asked the only question that felt important in that moment. Why did she not tell me? Soren was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because she wanted you to know yourself before you knew your power. She was afraid that if you knew too early, you would become the power and forget the person. She wanted you to be both. She knew the pain would be great. She also knew you were strong enough to carry it. Ethan looked up at the moon for a long time. He thought about his mother. He thought about the small things, the way she hummed, the way she always pressed her hand to his face when she said goodnight, the way she had looked at him sometimes, with an expression he had never been able to name. He understood now what that expression was. It was the look of someone who knows a beautiful secret and is keeping it safe. He returned to the Vale pack the following morning. He did not go in anger. He did not go to punish anyone. He walked back through the forest in the early light, with Lyra beside him. She had followed him into the trees the night before and seen everything, and he walked the way a man walks when he no longer needs anything from the place he is walking toward. The pack felt it before they saw it. That was the only way to describe it. A stillness came over the grounds as Ethan walked in, the way air changes before a storm. Not threatening, just different. Wolves who had ignored him for years stepped back instinctively. Children stopped running and looked at him with wide, curious eyes. Even the pack dogs, usually loud and restless in the morning, went quiet. Victor came out of the main house and stopped when he saw his son. He had intended to speak with authority. He opened his mouth to do exactly that. But his wolf, his own wolf, the one he had led this pack with for 20 years, lowered its head, not to Ethan's face, to something it sensed beneath the face, something so old and so deep that it had no choice but to recognize it. Victor stood in his doorway with his mouth slightly open and said nothing. Ethan spoke clearly and without raising his voice. He said that he was not there to take anything. He did not want the pack. He did not want the name he had been stripped of. He did not want his father's approval, which he understood now. He had been waiting for his entire life without ever truly receiving it. He was releasing that need. He named, quietly and specifically, the things that had been done to him over the years, not to wound, but because the pack deserved to hear the truth about the leadership they had chosen, and the way that leadership treated the people it was supposed to protect. Several pack members stepped away from Victor's side. Not all of them, but enough. Cade stood in the crowd. He said nothing. He had always been the loudest person in any room, and now he was completely silent. He was not angry. He looked like a man who had spent years building a wall to keep something out, and the wall had finally fallen, and there was nothing behind it but the old fear that had made him build it in the first place. He looked at Ethan with something close to grief. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I hope you find peace, Cade. What you were looking for was never mine to give, and it was never yours to take." He turned and walked away. In the months that followed, Ethan and Lyra built something new. They chose land at the edge of the old forest, far from the Vale Pack's territory, in a valley that caught the morning light and stayed warm even in winter. They built slowly and carefully. Word spread, the way word always spreads among wolves, not through announcements, but through feeling. Wolves began to arrive from different places. Wolves who had been cast out of their packs for being too old, or too quiet, or too different. Wolves who had shifted late or not at all. Wolves who had been told they were not enough. They came because something in the valley called to them. Something in the air. An old frequency. Low and deep and steady. The kind most people cannot hear until they have been still long enough to listen. Elder Soren came to live with them. He spent his days teaching Ethan the history of the Alpha King bloodline, not as a burden to carry, but as a story to understand. He taught him the old practices and the old medicines, and the old way of reading the forest. In the evenings, he told stories to anyone who wanted to listen, and there was always a circle gathered around him. Lyra ran the healing house. She was busy every day. She did not complain. She moved through the valley with the same calm she had carried in the forest the first night Ethan had met her. That same steadiness that made foxes trust her and frightened wolves exhale. One evening, near the end of winter, she and Ethan sat by the fire in the house they had built together. It was an ordinary evening. There was soup on the stove and snow on the ground outside, and the sound of someone playing a quiet instrument somewhere nearby. She said, without looking up from what she was doing, "I loved you before the silver eyes. I want you to know that." Ethan did not answer right away. He looked at the fire for a while. Then he said, "I know. That is the thing I will never stop being grateful for." 1 year after the night his father had cast him out, Ethan stood at the edge of the valley as the moon rose. He could hear the sounds of the community behind him, voices and laughter, and the soft movement of wolves through the trees. Children were chasing each other around the old oaks. 2 elders were sitting on the long bench near the fire pit, deep in an argument about something, both of them smiling. A young woman who had arrived only 2 weeks ago, thin and exhausted, was teaching a child how to braid rope. None of them were bowing. None of them were afraid. Lyra came and stood beside him, her shoulder warm against his arm. He thought about his mother. He thought about the door she had placed inside him before she left, the door she had known would take everything he had to open. He thought about the years of being invisible, of being too small in rooms that were supposed to be his, of carrying a weight that was never named, and therefore could never be put down. He thought about the night in the forest when it had all broken open, and how he had felt, in that first silver moment, exactly like himself for the first time. The pain had not disappeared. He was not going to say it had. There are wounds that leave marks, and pretending otherwise is its own kind of dishonesty. But the pain had changed. It had become something he carried without being crushed by it. It had become, in some way he was still learning to understand, the thing that had made him large enough to hold all of this: the valley, the people, the silence, the fire, the warmth of Lyra beside him. His family had tried to make him disappear. Instead, they had made him impossible to overlook. He breathed the cold night air deeply into his lungs, and the silver eyes caught the moonlight for just a moment, and the old forest was very still. He was home,